Behind Eddie Murphy's infamous long-haired wig and Wes Craven's genre-bending direction lies one of Hollywood's most bizarre production stories. From a tragic stunt accident that haunted the set to Murphy literally using this failure to escape his Paramount contract, Vampire in Brooklyn harbors secrets darker than its vampire protagonist. This cult classic's chaotic journey from serious horror script to comedy horror misfire reveals studio interference, OSHA violations, and a completely different ending that would have blown audiences' minds. Fact 1. A fatal stunt tragedy haunted production. The production of Vampire in Brooklyn was forever changed by a devastating accident that claimed the life of stuntwoman Sonia Davis on November 3, 1994. Davis, who was 27 years old at the time, was working as Angela Bassett's stunt double when she was asked to perform a 42-foot backward fall from a Los Angeles building into what should have been a safe landing zone. The stunt itself was designed with safety in mind, featuring a massive airbag that filled the entire 12-foot wide alley between buildings. According to cinematographer Mark Irwin, who witnessed the tragedy, the airbag was so enormous that it looked like a house and completely filled the space, which is why there wasn't even an ambulance on standby that second night of filming. The crew believed there was no way Davis could miss the landing unless something went terribly wrong with the stunt itself. What made this tragedy even more heartbreaking was that Davis's mother, Wanda Sapp, and her siblings were visiting the set that day and witnessed the entire accident unfold before their eyes. Davis had been hanging from the side of the building, preparing for what should have been a routine fall, when the unthinkable happened. Instead of landing safely on the airbag as planned, she bounced off the cushioned surface, slammed into the opposing building wall, and then crashed to the ground below. Davis didn't die immediately from the impact. She was rushed to the hospital with critical injuries and fought for her life for 2 agonizing weeks before succumbing to her wounds on November 14th. The accident sent shockwaves through the entire production, with editor Patrick Lussier later describing how the tragic death created a heavy emotional weight that lingered over the remainder of filming. Angela Bassett, who had worked with Davis on 3 previous films, including What's Love Got to Do With It, released a statement calling her a dedicated artist who was a woman of God first and foremost. Fact 2. Davis's eerie last words predicted disaster. In what can only be described as a chilling premonition, Sonia Davis expressed serious doubts about the safety of her final stunt just moments before the accident that would claim her life. According to witnesses on the set, including her own mother who was present that day, Davis repeatedly questioned the stunt coordinator with the same haunting phrase 3 separate times, asking, "Are you sure?" with growing concern in her voice. These weren't casual questions from a nervous performer, but rather the pointed inquiries of an experienced professional who sensed something was wrong with the setup. Davis had been working as a stuntwoman for several years by 1994 and had built up considerable experience in high-risk maneuvers, having performed stunts in major films like Time Cop and Strange Days before taking on the Vampire in Brooklyn assignment. Her background meant she understood the mechanics of dangerous stunts and could recognize when safety protocols might not be adequate. The fact that her mother, Wanda Sapp, overheard these repeated questions made them even more significant when the family later filed their $10 million wrongful death lawsuit against Paramount Pictures and Eddie Murphy's production company. According to the legal filing, Davis had been pressured into performing the stunt despite her obvious reservations about whether the safety measures were sufficient for such a dangerous 42-foot fall. What makes this detail particularly unsettling is that Davis was known among her colleagues as a confident and skilled stunt performer who rarely expressed hesitation about her work. Angela Bassett had specifically requested Davis as her stunt double because of their successful working relationship on previous projects, and Davis was considered one of the few African-American stuntwomen working consistently in Hollywood at the time. For someone with her experience and reputation to voice such clear concerns 3 times in a row suggests that her instincts were picking up on real dangers that the production team either missed or chose to ignore in their rush to complete the scene. Fact 3. OSHA slapped Paramount with violations and fines. Following their investigation into Sonia Davis's death, California's Division of Occupational Safety and Health Administration delivered a damning verdict against Paramount Pictures by issuing 4 separate safety citations and imposing a $29,000 fine for violations that contributed to the fatal accident. This official government response confirmed that the tragedy wasn't just a freak accident, but rather the result of preventable safety failures on the part of the production company. OSHA, which is the federal agency responsible for workplace safety standards, conducted a thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding the stunt gone wrong and determined that Paramount had failed to follow proper safety protocols that could have saved Davis's life. The 4 citations represented specific areas where the production company had cut corners or ignored established industry standards for high-risk stunts, though the exact details of each violation weren't made public at the time. The $29,000 fine might seem relatively small by today's standards, but in 1994, it represented a significant penalty that sent a clear message to the film industry about the consequences of prioritizing schedule and budget over performer safety. What made the OSHA findings particularly significant was that they provided official validation for the claims made by Davis's family in their wrongful death lawsuit, which alleged that proper safety protocols had not been met and that Davis herself had expressed hesitation about performing the dangerous stunt. The citations also highlighted a broader problem within the film industry during the 1990s, when safety regulations for stunt work were less stringent than they would become in later decades. The fact that a major studio like Paramount could receive multiple safety violations for a single incident demonstrated just how inadequate the existing safety measures were for protecting stunt performers who risked their lives to create the spectacular action sequences that audiences expected from big-budget Hollywood productions. Fact 4. Murphy used this flop to escape his contract. Eddie Murphy deliberately chose to make Vampire in Brooklyn as his final film under an exclusive contract with Paramount Pictures, essentially using what many considered a career misstep as his ticket to freedom from a deal that had lasted over a decade. Murphy had been locked into this lucrative but restrictive agreement with Paramount since 1982, starting with 48 Hours and continuing through the entire Beverly Hills Cop franchise, which had made him one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. By 1991, Murphy had grown tired of the types of roles Paramount was offering him and desperately wanted to explore different creative opportunities with other studios. But he still owed the company at least 4 more films to complete his contractual obligations. Rather than fight the contract in court or pay expensive penalties to break free, Murphy made a calculated decision to fulfill his remaining duties with projects that would satisfy Paramount while positioning him for the career moves he really wanted to make. In a candid interview with Rolling Stone years later, Murphy admitted the strategic nature of his choice, saying, "The only way I was able to do Nutty Professor and to get out of my Paramount deal, I had to do Vampire in Brooklyn." This revelation showed that Murphy was willing to risk his reputation on a film he knew might not succeed commercially in order to gain the creative freedom he craved for future projects. The irony of Murphy's situation was that Vampire in Brooklyn, despite receiving harsh reviews and disappointing box office numbers, actually served its intended purpose perfectly by allowing him to move forward with the Nutty Professor at a different studio. That film became a massive hit and revitalized Murphy's career in the late 1990s, proving that sometimes an apparent failure can be the stepping stone to greater success when it's part of a larger strategic plan. Fact 5. The original ending was a Brooklyn Bridge spectacle. The final battle between Eddie Murphy's Vampire and the human heroes was originally conceived as a death-defying spectacle that would have taken place on one of New York's most famous landmarks, with an oil tanker truck literally hanging off the side of the Brooklyn Bridge. Editor Patrick Lussier, who worked closely with director Wes Craven throughout the production, revealed this stunning detail about the script's original climax that audiences never got to see. According to Lussier's recollections from working on the film, the early drafts featured an incredibly ambitious action sequence where Eddie Murphy's Maximilian, Angela Bassett's Rita, and Alan Payne's Justice would have their final confrontation inside or around a massive oil tanker that was somehow suspended from the iconic Brooklyn Bridge. This would have created a visually spectacular and genuinely dangerous-looking finale that combined the vampire horror elements with big-budget action movie thrills. The original concept would have been significantly more expensive and logistically challenging to film than the ending that eventually made it into the movie. Requiring extensive special effects work, location permits for one of New York's busiest bridges, and complex safety coordination for the actors and stunt performers involved in the sequence. The image of a giant oil tanker hanging precariously from the Brooklyn Bridge would have created an unforgettable visual that could have become one of the most memorable scenes in either Murphy's or Craven's filmography. Unfortunately, this epic finale was scrapped during the development process as the studio pushed for changes that would make the film more comedic and less expensive to produce. Lussier explained that the original drafts of the script were much darker, more Brooklyn-focused, and significantly more ambitious in scope than what eventually reached theaters, suggesting that the oil tanker bridge sequence was just one of many spectacular elements that got lost when the studio decided to take the movie in a different direction. Fact 6. Studio executives used The Shining as comedy reference. In one of the most bizarre examples of studio interference in film history, Paramount executives actually pointed to Jack Nicholson's terrifying performance in The Shining as an example of the kind of humor they wanted to see more of in Vampire in Brooklyn. This absurd comparison happened during a heated meeting where studio heads had dragged Wes Craven in to complain that the dailies they were seeing weren't funny enough for their liking. The executives had become concerned that the film was leaning too heavily into genuine horror territory and demanded that Craven inject more comedic elements into Eddie Murphy's vampire character and the overall tone of the movie. When they struggled to articulate exactly what kind of humor they were looking for, someone in the room made the incredibly tone-deaf suggestion that Craven should make the film funny in the same way that Jack Nicholson's unhinged performance in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining was entertaining. Craven, who was already frustrated with the constant studio meddling in his creative vision, couldn't believe what he was hearing and fired back with a response that perfectly captured the absurdity of the situation. According to editor Patrick Lussier, who recounted this story years later, Craven said, "Do you hear yourself? You're saying this needs to be funny? Like The Shining." The director's incredulous response highlighted just how out of touch the executives were with both horror as a genre and the specific tone they were asking him to achieve. This exchange perfectly encapsulated the creative tensions that plagued the entire production, with Eddie Murphy wanting to make a serious horror film in the vein of Craven's earlier work The Serpent and the Rainbow, while Paramount executives kept pushing for something more like Murphy's previous Beverly Hills Cop comedies. The fact that studio heads would reference one of cinema's most genuinely disturbing psychological horror films as a model for comedy showed just how confused the entire project had become. Fact 7. Murphy blamed his career low on a wig. Years after the film's disappointing reception, Eddie Murphy identified a surprisingly specific culprit for Vampire in Brooklyn's failure when he told Rolling Stone magazine in 2011 that the entire movie was doomed by a single wardrobe choice. In his characteristically blunt style, Murphy explained, "You know what ruined that movie? The wig. I walked out in that long-haired wig and people said, 'Oh, get the F out of here. What the hell is this?'" This candid admission came during a period when Murphy was reflecting on some of the less successful projects in his filmography, and he seemed genuinely convinced that the flowing black hairpiece he wore as the vampire Maximilian had single-handedly destroyed audience acceptance of his character. The wig was designed to give Murphy's vampire a more romantic and mysterious appearance that would fit with the film's gothic horror elements. But according to Murphy's assessment, it had the opposite effect on viewers who were expecting something completely different from the comedian. Murphy's focus on this particular detail suggests that he believed audiences rejected the film not because of its tone, script problems, or genre confusion, but simply because they couldn't take him seriously as a romantic leading man while wearing what he considered an unconvincing hairpiece. The comment also reveals Murphy's frustration with how the film was received, since he had genuinely tried to stretch his acting abilities by playing a straight dramatic role, rather than relying on his usual comedic persona. Looking back at the film today, the wig doesn't appear nearly as problematic as Murphy remembered it, which suggests that his harsh judgment might have been colored by the overall disappointment of the project's commercial and critical failure. The fact that one of Hollywood's biggest stars would blame a single costume element for an entire movie's problems shows just how personally he took the negative reaction to what was supposed to be a serious creative departure for his career. Fact 8. Only 3 days were actually shot in Brooklyn. Despite having Brooklyn prominently featured in its title and the entire plot revolving around the famous New York borough, Vampire in Brooklyn was almost entirely filmed on the other side of the country in Los Angeles, soundstages and backlots. Out of the 55 total days of principal photography, only 3 days were actually spent on location in New York City, making the film's connection to its supposed setting surprisingly minimal. This revelation becomes even more striking when you consider that Brooklyn's distinctive urban atmosphere and authentic street locations were supposed to be central to the film's identity and appeal. The production schedule ran from October 4th 1994 through January 14, 1995, but the vast majority of those months were spent recreating Brooklyn on Hollywood sets rather than capturing the real thing. Paramount Studios at 5555 Melrose Avenue in Hollywood served as the primary filming location, where elaborate sets were constructed to mimic Brooklyn neighborhoods, apartment buildings, and street scenes. Movie fans who pay close attention to details often noticed that certain scenes looked more like Hollywood backlot constructions than authentic New York locations, and their instincts were absolutely correct. One fan discussion forum specifically mentioned that the area around Rita's apartment looked clearly artificial, describing it as obviously being a backlot rather than a real Brooklyn neighborhood where people actually lived and worked. The decision to film primarily in Los Angeles was likely driven by budget considerations and the convenience of having access to Paramount's extensive studio facilities, but it meant that a movie supposedly celebrating Brooklyn's unique character and culture was actually created thousands of miles away from the place it claimed to represent. This disconnect between the film's title and its actual production locations adds another layer to the project's overall sense of creative confusion and missed opportunities for authenticity. Fact 9. It was Murphy's first villain role ever. Throughout his entire career up to 1995, Eddie Murphy had never taken on the role of a genuine antagonist as the lead character in any of his films, making Vampire in Brooklyn a truly unprecedented departure for the comedy superstar. From his early days on Saturday Night Live through his breakout success in 48 Hours and the Beverly Hills Cop franchise, Murphy had always played lovable rogues, wisecracking heroes, or well-meaning underdogs who audiences were meant to root for from beginning to end. This career-long pattern made his decision to portray Maximilian, a ruthless vampire who murders innocent people and manipulates others for his own survival, all the more surprising for fans who had come to expect Murphy to be the good guy in every story. In interviews promoting the film, Murphy expressed genuine excitement about this creative challenge, explaining, "I've always wanted to do something where I was the villain in the movie," and describing how much he enjoyed exploring a character who operated from completely selfish motivations. What made Murphy's villainous turn even more interesting was that Maximilian wasn't just a comedic bad guy or a misunderstood anti-hero, but rather a genuinely menacing supernatural predator who commits brutal acts of violence throughout the film. The character rips out hearts, manipulates people through mind control, and shows no remorse for the pain he causes others in his quest to find a vampire mate before the next full moon arrives. Murphy approached this dark role with surprising seriousness, playing most of his scenes as Maximilian completely straight, rather than relying on his trademark humor and rapid-fire delivery. This dramatic restraint represented a significant acting stretch for someone who had built his reputation on being one of Hollywood's most naturally funny performers, and it demonstrated Murphy's genuine desire to expand his range beyond the comedic characters that had made him famous. Fact 10. A wrongful death lawsuit mysteriously vanished. The $10 million wrongful death lawsuit, filed by Sonia Davis's family against Paramount Pictures, Eddie Murphy's production company, director Wes Craven, and stunt coordinator Alan O'Leary, came to an abrupt and mysterious end when their high-profile attorney died unexpectedly in the middle of the legal proceedings. The family had retained Melvin Belli, one of California's most famous personal injury lawyers, to represent them in their fight for justice and compensation following Davis's tragic death on the set. Belli was a legendary figure in the legal world, known for his flamboyant courtroom style and his success in winning massive settlements for clients in high-profile cases involving celebrities and major corporations. His involvement in the case suggested that the Davis family was serious about holding the production companies accountable for what they believed were preventable safety failures that led to their daughter's death. The lawsuit specifically alleged that proper safety protocols had not been followed, and that Davis had been pressured into performing the dangerous stunt, despite expressing clear reservations about its safety. However, the legal proceedings took an unexpected turn when Belli passed away in 1996, just as the case was gaining momentum and moving through the court system. His death left the Davis family without their primary legal advocate at a crucial time when they needed experienced representation to navigate the complex litigation against well-funded defendants who could afford teams of skilled defense attorneys. After Belli's death, there is virtually no public record of what happened to the wrongful death lawsuit, leading to speculation that the case was either dropped entirely or settled quietly out of court with terms that included confidentiality agreements. The complete disappearance of information about the case's resolution has left many questions unanswered about whether the Davis family ever received any compensation for their loss or whether the defendants were held legally accountable for the safety violations that contributed to the tragedy. Fact 11. The film directly references Blackula in dialogue. In one of the most clever moments of self-awareness in the entire film, Kadeem Hardison's character Julius makes a direct reference to the 1972 blaxploitation vampire movie Blackula when he tells Eddie Murphy's vampire Maximilian, "You ain't gotta pull that old Blackula shit with me." This line serves as both a comedic moment and a deliberate acknowledgement of the film's place within the tradition of African-American vampire cinema that began over 2 decades earlier. The reference was particularly meaningful because Blackula had been the first major Hollywood film to feature a black vampire as the main character, starring William Marshall as an African prince who gets turned into a vampire by Count Dracula himself, and then awakens in 1970s Los Angeles. By having Julius specifically mention this earlier film, the writers were showing that they understood Vampire in Brooklyn was following in the footsteps of a groundbreaking movie that had tackled similar themes of bringing vampire mythology into contemporary black urban communities. The line also worked as a form of street-smart dialogue that felt natural coming from Julius, a small-time numbers runner who would likely be familiar with the pop culture references that shaped his generation's understanding of supernatural stories. For audiences who caught the reference, it added an extra layer of humor and showed that the filmmakers weren't trying to pretend they had invented the concept of black vampires, but rather were building on an existing tradition in creative and respectful ways. Film critic Roger Ebert specifically mentioned this Blackula reference in his review, noting how it highlighted the connection between the two films, while also suggesting that the original 1970s movie had been superior to the newer attempt. The fact that multiple reviewers picked up on this single line of dialogue demonstrates how effectively it served as both an inside joke for horror fans and a way to position Vampire in Brooklyn within the broader context of vampire cinema history. Fact 12. Craven wanted Murphy to play it completely straight. Director Wes Craven made the bold creative decision to strip away Eddie Murphy's trademark comedic energy and instead pushed the superstar comedian to deliver what was essentially a dramatic performance as the vampire Maximilian. In interviews about his approach to the film, Craven explained, "I wanted Eddie to be essentially a serious character, rather than allowing Murphy to fall back on the rapid-fire jokes and physical comedy that had made him one of Hollywood's biggest stars." This directorial choice represented a significant risk for both men, since Murphy's entire career had been built on his ability to make audiences laugh through his quick wit, impersonations, and energetic delivery style that had first made him famous on Saturday Night Live. By asking Murphy to play the vampire role completely straight, Craven was essentially asking one of comedy's most recognizable performers to suppress the very qualities that audiences expected and loved about his screen presence. Craven's reasoning behind this approach was rooted in his belief that the horror elements of the story would be more effective if Murphy's character felt genuinely threatening and mysterious, rather than comedic. Approachable. The director wanted audiences to feel real tension and fear when Maximilian appeared on screen, which would have been impossible if Murphy had been cracking jokes and mugging for the camera in his usual style. The experiment produced mixed results, with some critics and audiences appreciating Murphy's willingness to stretch his acting abilities in unexpected directions, while others felt confused or disappointed by the absence of the humor they had come to expect from his performances. Murphy himself seemed to understand that this dramatic restraint was necessary for the character to work, even though it meant abandoning the comedic approach that had brought him fame and fortune throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. Fact 13. It was referenced in Scream 6, decades later. Nearly 3 decades after its original release, Vampire in Brooklyn received an unexpected tribute when it was specifically mentioned alongside other Wes Craven films in a memorable scene from Scream 6, which hit theaters in 2023. This reference appeared during the subway sequence of the latest Scream installment, where the filmmakers paid homage to Craven's entire body of work by including nods to both his most famous and his more obscure directorial efforts. The inclusion of Vampire in Brooklyn in this tribute scene was particularly significant because it showed that even Craven's less commercially successful films had maintained a place of respect within the horror community and among the people who continued his Scream franchise after his death in 2015. While movies like A Nightmare on Elm Street and the original Scream films would be obvious choices for such a tribute, the fact that the filmmakers specifically chose to honor Vampire in Brooklyn demonstrated their appreciation for the full range of Craven's creative output. This reference also represented a form of cinematic rehabilitation for a movie that had been largely dismissed or forgotten by mainstream audiences, giving it a new moment of recognition within one of horror's most popular ongoing franchises. The Scream series has always been known for its self-aware commentary on horror movie conventions and its detailed knowledge of genre history, so having Vampire in Brooklyn mentioned alongside Craven's other works served as a kind of critical reevaluation. For fans who had discovered or rediscovered Vampire in Brooklyn in the years since its original release, seeing it acknowledged in Scream 6 likely felt like validation of their appreciation for what many consider an underrated entry in both Murphy's and Craven's filmographies. The reference helped cement the film's status as a cult classic that deserved recognition alongside the director's more widely celebrated achievements in horror cinema. Fact 14. Justice wore Adidas for half the movie. In one of the most peculiar wardrobe decisions in the entire film, Alan Payne's character, Detective Justice, appears wearing the same Adidas sweater throughout roughly half of Vampire in Brooklyn's runtime, creating an oddly specific continuity choice that eagle-eyed viewers have noticed and commented on over the years. This detail stands out because it's such an unusual costuming decision for a major character in a big-budget Hollywood production, where wardrobe departments typically plan multiple outfit changes to show the passage of time and keep characters looking fresh on screen. The Adidas sweater becomes almost like a character trait for Justice, appearing in scene after scene as he investigates the vampire murders alongside his partner Rita and tries to protect her from Maximilian's supernatural influence. What makes this wardrobe choice even more noticeable is that it spans across multiple days within the film's timeline, suggesting that either Justice has a very limited wardrobe or the costume department made a deliberate decision to keep him in the same recognizable piece of clothing for storytelling reasons. This kind of specific detail often becomes a talking point among fans who watch movies multiple times and start to notice patterns or quirks that might not be apparent during a first viewing. The fact that the Adidas logo is prominently displayed throughout so many scenes also raises questions about whether this represented some kind of product placement deal or if it was simply a practical decision by the wardrobe department to establish a consistent look for the character. While it might seem like a minor detail in the context of a movie about vampires and supernatural romance, these kinds of continuity choices can actually have a significant impact on how audiences perceive characters and their authenticity within the story world. Justice's persistent Adidas sweater has become one of those oddly memorable details that fans remember long after they've forgotten other aspects of the plot. Fact 15. The script was much darker and Brooklyn-centric. According to editor Patrick Lussier, who worked closely with Wes Craven throughout the production process, the original drafts of Vampire in Brooklyn were significantly different from what audiences eventually saw in theaters, featuring content that was much darker and much more Brooklyn-centric and very cool before studio interference transformed the project into something completely different. This revelation suggests that the film we know today represents only a shadow of what Craven and Eddie Murphy originally intended to create. Lussier's comments about the early script versions paint a picture of a movie that would have been much more grounded in the authentic culture and atmosphere of Brooklyn itself, rather than the Hollywood studio recreation that dominated the final product. The very cool description implies that the original concept had a level of street credibility and urban authenticity that got lost during the development process as Paramount executives pushed for changes that would make the film more commercially appealing to mainstream audiences. The darker tone that Lussier described would have aligned much better with Eddie Murphy's stated desire to make a serious horror film in the tradition of Wes Craven's earlier work like The Serpent and the Rainbow, rather than the comedy-horror hybrid that the studio ultimately demanded. This original vision would have allowed Craven to explore the vampire mythology within a more realistic urban setting, while giving Murphy the dramatic role he was seeking to expand his acting range. The fact that these early drafts were considered much more Brooklyn-centric also suggests that the original script would have made better use of the borough's unique cultural identity and neighborhood characteristics, rather than treating the location as just another generic urban backdrop. The loss of this authentic Brooklyn flavor during the rewriting process may have contributed to the film's overall sense of disconnection from the place that inspired its title.